So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this edition of the Data at Breakfast. This morning, we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Guy Lamb from the University of Stellenbosch. In fact, probably less than a week ago, I read, or about a week ago, I read his very nice article in The Conversation, and I just pushed my luck and emailed him and asked him if he would be kind enough to give us a talk on the same topic, because it's also related to data. Yeah? Maybe not scientific data, but data that are nevertheless very, very important for us. Who have experienced what was going on last week. So Dr. Lamb is at the University of Stellenbosch in the political science department, and he started his career at the Center of Conflict Resolution, after which he became a senior research fellow from 2006 to 2012 at the Institute for Security Studies. Between 2012 and 2020, he was the director of the Safety and Violence Initiative of the University of Cape Town, and subsequently moved to Stellenbosch. So Dr. Lamb, we are really happy to have you address us on this very topical subject that is of interest to all of us. And you see from the large number of participants that it's really interesting. Even if it is so early in the morning, many people woke up to listen to you. Before I ask you to, I don't know, will you share your screen and have some slides? Yeah, then maybe
yes, I'm going to put up.
While you start that procedure, I remind the participants to please make use of the Q&A facility to ask the questions. And Ilya and Kimara, that you also see on the panel, who are always working behind the scenes to make this the data breakfast happen, will moderate the questions after the talk of Dr. Lamb. So Dr. Lamb, I see your screen is already showing up. If you're welcome to start with your presentation. Thank you very much.
Just one quick question, Francesco. How long do you want me to speak for?
Usually we try to keep it to 1 hour, because, you know, when we started this data breakfast, it was really coupled to a breakfast. Yeah,
okay.
And after 8:30, usually people had to go back to work. So if we, including the question, we can stick to 1 hour, plus minus 5-10 minutes, nobody will die.
No, it's fine. I'm not going to, I was planning to speak for at the most half an hour, because I think there are a lot of interesting questions that will come from this. So let me stick to the half an hour. So good morning, everyone. I just wanted to minimize the camera so I can see my slides. Thank you so much for this opportunity for giving an input today. And thank you very much for the kind introduction. So I'm based at the Political Science Department at Stellenbosch University, but have been working on violence and violence prevention for many years, and ran this interdisciplinary center at University of Cape Town, which brought together different elements, different disciplines, different academics within the University of Cape Town, including people from computer sciences as well. But today I'm more of a kind of a qualitative person than a quantitative person, so I'm going to be focusing more on the qualitative elements. But of course, there is a lot of data work that can be done going forward, considering, given what's happened in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, and you know, kind of looking at, you know, what are the predictive models going forward, which I think is going to be quite important work that needs to be done. But let me jump into this. I'm going to speak hopefully no more than half an hour, and also will welcome any comments and questions going forward. So the sort of work that I'm speaking on now, and Francesco, thank you for referencing the Conversation article, is based on some previous work that I've done. Also, I do teach on violence and violence prevention and crime prevention within South Africa and other places. So it's drawing together strands of some of the work that I've done on xenophobic violence and protest violence and policing, and combining that with some sort of theoretical insights. So to start off, what I'm going to do is take you through a little bit of theory, a little bit of concepts, and then get into a discussion about South Africa, and then sort of focusing on what's happened more recently within South Africa. So let me get started. Right. Okay, so just with definition, so there's lots of terms that are being used, of course, within the context of the recent violence. There's insurrectionist violence, there's been sort of politically orientated violence, there has been, obviously conversations about unrest, conversations about looting, kind of ministers cannot agree on how to define the violence going forward. But within the academic literature about violence, there's usually two terms that are used, to sort of fairly abstract terms that are used, sort of neutral terms that are used. So the first one would be interpersonal violence, which largely relates to individuals who are perpetrating violence against themselves. So one person who perpetrates violence against another person. Then, of course, there's self-directed violence, which is, a person who would perpetrate violence against themselves. I'm not sure why this is jumping forward, who perpetrates violence against themselves. So that would be sort of suicides. And of course, you get collective violence. And collective violence is largely involving two or more persons. So this is the definition, and the World Health Organization has got some quite useful definitions about violence. I've put this one up here, which is the instrumental use of violence by people who identify themselves as member of a group against another group or set of individuals in order to achieve political, economic, or social objectives. So it's fairly broad in that sort of definition. I mean, the kind of key issue here, it's about a group, and it has some, where it's this people who are part of this group and identify as a group, but it's a kind of very loose definition. So the important thing, it's about physical damage to either persons or objects, and it's, there are two or more perpetrators involved in this. It's not one person against another person. That's interpersonal violence. And there's usually some form of coordination, and the coordination can be very loosely defined. So moving forward, so kind of key aspects about collective violence, and there's a very interesting scholar by the name of Charles Tilley, who writes about collective violence, and he uses this analogy, which I find quite helpful, about collective violence resembling weather, is that it's complicated, it's changing, it's unpredictable, but it results from similar causes variously combined at different times and places. And I think this is, if we look at the most recent violence in KwaZulu-Natal in particular, is that it was, in a way, violence was expected following the arrest of former President Zuma, but not the degree of violence and the extent of violence that happened, and the unpredictability about it. But what I will go into, I'm not sure why it keeps doing that, so I'll just have to keep jumping back, is that there were many kind of common causes for this violence that had driven previous violence within KZN in particular, and also in Gauteng. So violence that had happened in 2019, violence that had happened in 2015, violence in 2008, violence during the political transition, even violence during the apartheid era. So there's like some similar dynamics there. And a very important way of looking at it as well, and I think this comes into some of the work around you do on kind of computer modeling. It's about looking at different factors that influence models. And the one thing we know about violence, both interpersonal and collective violence, is that these different risk and protective factors for violence are risk factors that can result in violence taking place, or protective factors that can prevent violence from taking place. And we usually know that violence happens due to a combination of these risk factors interacting with protective factors over a pathway or over a period of time. And these kind of risk and protective factors, especially for collective violence, are influenced by social ties, structures, and processes. And this was a sort of very clearly evident within KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng in the recent weeks. So the important thing is this dynamic between risk and protective factors. If you've got a number of protective factors in place, the risk factors aren't as influential in resulting in violence. So for example, we saw recently there were some communities where there was looting and unrest, and other communities there weren't. And usually this has to do in those communities where there weren't, as the protective factors certainly outweighed the risk factors. And then a couple of key aspects to look at as well, and this is something that I raised in my conversation article about collective violence, is that collective violence often is not spontaneous. It's not about people waking up and deciding, as individuals, that we're all going to go out and loot, or we're all going to go out and burn something, or destroy a clinic, or attack the police. There's usually something called boundary activation, which is about where the groups who are going to perpetrate violence, there is usually some form of leadership, and there's usually some form of groups that are encouraging the violence. And apologies, I just want to, something's happening with my Zoom at the moment. Just want to bring it back. All right. Okay, there's usually this thing called boundary activation, where there's kind of groups or leaders in specific communities that start to talk about and start to communicate about there is a problem, and identify a specific target, a specific population, a specific places that are the reason for why we're having a problem, or we need to do something about this problem. And it's this kind of us and them kind of divide. And you usually see this around sort of xenophobic violence, where individuals and groups and leaders in specific communities to say, well, the problems we're facing in this community have to do with the other people, have to do with the foreigners, have to do with the undocumented foreign nationals, and therefore we need to do something about it. We need to chase them out. And this is where brokerage comes in. This is where the boundary's been activated, and then kind of groups and individuals and leaders and political figures within communities will say, well, in order to solve our problem, we need to do this. In order to express our anger, we need to do this. So they sort of create this link between the sort of negative experiences people are having, the challenges people are having, the frustrations people are having, and saying, you can, target your frustrations here. You can go and do this, and it will solve your problem. You need to, kind of go and target these particular people because they are wrong, they are evil, they shouldn't be here. So this is often at play within the context of collective violence. It's someone who's activating a boundary and someone who is kind of determining, well, encouraging people to go and do acts of violence. So let's move into the sort of South African context here. So there's different forms of collective violence. Obviously, in our minds, we're very concerned about the unrest and the looting that's happened within South Africa. But of course, there are many different forms of collective violence that often interplay. So the most common within South Africa has been protest violence, and often referred to as sort of service delivery protest violence, where you've got poorer, marginalized communities protesting largely against the state. It has to do with, poor delivery around water, electricity, housing, often protests about a lack of jobs, often protesting because illegal electricity has been cut off. Often protests are about local government corruption and then kind of ineptitude. And that often spirals into kind of violence where, roads are blocked off, tires are burned, often some infrastructure will be destroyed and burnt. Then you often see looting linked to this particular violence. Usually it's spaza shops and townships and informal settlements. But of course, that's not the only type. I mean, related to this, one gets labor strikes, and that often turns violent. Within a number of cities, we have gang violence, particularly problematic in Cape Town, Gqeberha, and parts of Gauteng. Then we've seen which has been linked to many other aspects of collective violence, has been xenophobic violence. And this is where we've had quite a lot of looting and unrest in the past, but it's tended to be quite localized, with the exception of 2015, 2008, and a bit in 2019, particularly in Durban, where it did spread beyond certain areas and got to city centers, but was largely contained, after a day or so, and didn't extend as far as the violence has extended within KZN and Gauteng recently. Apologies, gang violence mentioned twice there. Then, of course, taxi violence. This is an ongoing issue. I mean, it's a major problem in Cape Town at the moment. It's shut down public transport within many parts of Cape Town, and this is also kind of a collective form because it's certain taxi groups versus other taxi groups competing over access to routes and ranks, asserting control, looking to kind of move against certain competition or eliminate certain competition. There's usually quite extensive violence involved in that. Then we have violence related to political parties. We're seeing this increasingly within the ruling party, where violence is used in the context of branch meetings, where party representatives and members are elected into leadership positions. We're also seeing political assassinations. This has been going on for a while, but it's likely to escalate going forward in the build up to the local government elections. And then finally, we get orchestrated looting, which we've seen recently. Hasn't been such a major issue within South Africa. We've seen it contained in areas, but now we've seen it a whole new level of looting taking place. And of course, this is a type of collective violence. Then it's an issue just going back to a bit of kind of conceptualization around groups and violence. And, we see many contexts within South Africa where people form in groups and express protests, express dissatisfaction. but it's when this kind of dissatisfaction leads to violence, and is something that we really need to pay attention to. And there's so many different drivers that lead to groups of people coming together and becoming violent. Back to that. And I've just kind of highlighted a few here. So, kind of key ones to identify here are, if we're looking at specifically at the violence that's taken place at the moment, is the role of aggressive participants. And I will kind of get into a bit more detail about that. Often violent leadership is quite important. The context in which the violence happens is quite important, sometimes the nature of the space. If we're looking at protests, often it's if those who are staging the protest aren't really well organized, you can often see violence taking place. And then, of course, a police intervention can often escalate issues. But I'm going to go into a bit more detail about that now. When it comes to aggressive participants, when you sort of have these crowd contexts, it's usually you've got some form of group or groups of individuals, often young men, who seek to perpetrate violence against property, police, and rival groups. They'll go in with the intention of creating violence. So you often see protests happening, and you'll see groups within the protests who will engage in violent acts, and then the protest then tends to escalate into violence very quickly as the sort of violence becomes almost contagious, and other members in the protest or the crowd participate in the violence. Then what that leads to is often the police will clamp down, and then the violence tends to escalate because then the crowd and elements in the crowd respond to the police. And often this is linked to sort of forms of aggressive masculinity. So, if you look at the recent looting, you had aggressive groups, individuals at the forefront of it. Police not really intervening. I think concerns expressed by the police that if they intervened, that they may escalate the situation in many contexts, and then you'd see potentially more damage to property and more loss of life, particularly when the police don't have the numbers to contain the violence that's happening. And sort of this aggressive participant is key to many forms of collective violence we're seeing within South Africa. And then just quickly on protests, this inadequate organization is usually we've seen in South Africa with service delivery protests become violent pretty quickly because these are sort of fairly quickly organized community protests. So they haven't put resources into place around marshals for crowd control. Often there's permission hasn't been secured from the relevant sort of local government authorities or from the police or the municipality. And as a result, the police aren't that well prepared for it and haven't necessarily put measures into place. So tend to resort through the use of force to try and contain the violence as quickly as possible. And then often it escalates. And in these sort of protests, often in these kind of crowd contexts, often the sort of communication between protesters and between police is obviously not particularly effective, and the sort of resources to contain the protest aren't as good as they should be, so often they descend into violence very quickly. Then police violence, and this is something obviously we've been concerned with quite a bit within South Africa. It wasn't such a focus within the recent violence, but certainly during lockdown, the sort of hard lockdowns within South Africa, during other protests, during the Marikana massacre that happened in 2012, the focus on the police has been quite considerable. And we know through studies throughout the world that the role of the police in crowd context can actually escalate. It's sort of the strongest predictor that crowd contexts can become violent. And it then sort of results in clash between the police and community members. And it can, kind of lead to rioting, looting, massacres, and in extreme cases. And so we've seen this, for example, in the US, we've seen this in many parts of Western Europe, we've seen this in Colombia recently, is that, when the police get involved and you use kind of militarized and aggressive tactics, it does tend to result in much higher degrees and greater scales of violence that can take place. Then this is an important one for certainly the looting and the unrest that happened recently. And this is something that I sort of talk about within my conversational articles about the context of collective violence. And this is particularly relevant when it comes to looting, where you get groups of people together and the sort of psychology is different to when a person is by themselves. When you're together as a group, there are different norms, and it really depends on what the sort of dominant norms that emerge within the groups are, and what role that takes. So usually what happens is if certain individuals and you've got certain violent groups within a crowd and they perpetrate violence, others may be caught up in that and start to engage in violence themselves, whereas as individuals, they might not be violent people, but in the context of the crowd, because others are doing it, it kind of builds this momentum. And also the sort of group context provide this kind of degree of camouflage and impunity, and especially this when it comes to, throwing a petrol bomb or engaging in looting. If there are lots of people doing it, and you participated in in that sort of act as well, is that there's a chance of you getting away with it quite high, because there's so many people doing it and the police can't arrest everyone and contain everyone or stop everyone. But also an important thing to do is that in many of these kind of cases of violence, is there are individuals that are seeking notoriety, they're seeking to be recognized, they're seeking status. I mean, you've seen some very interesting studies by Wits University that looked at service delivery protests and pointed to the role of young men in many service delivery protests who typically are marginalized, don't have much status within communities because they're unemployed, are poor. But in the context of protests, kind of taking a violent role will kind of get you noticed within the community, gives you some form of status within that kind of context. So these things are quite prominent, and I think kind of played out within the context of the looting, especially around when we saw these sort of, violent groups initially breaking into malls, and these were sort of, largely young men who kind of been mobilized to do this particular job, and may have been seeking notoriety and status in that context as well. Then, of course, the role of violent leadership, and this has been so important going forward. And of course, the authorities, the South African government, is focusing on these particular individuals who sort of been instigating the violence, who kind of planned the violence, who orchestrated the violence. And violent leadership is so important in this. So it's usually individuals who are prone to interpersonal violence, but it's not necessarily the case, but certainly they would view violence as a key way of solving a problem, as a way to build legitimacy, to build status. And these are the individuals that usually are engaging in this form of brokering, that are encouraging people to go in and engage in violence, whether it's at a sort of social media level or it's actually in communities where the violence happening. So it's, they're using this kind of incendiary language, hate speech, and they're encouraging people to go and target specific places. And then, of course, within KwaZulu-Natal, it's particularly relevant, but it's not only the case there, is the places that have usually had violence in the past are often prone to violence in the future, or prone to violence now. And it has to do with a number of factors here. So, one that's kind of always stands out is about this low degree of trust that exists between, sort of communities and government. Usually between local government and communities, but often between the police and communities. And often it's around sort of groups that perpetrated violence in the past are still existing in these sort of communities and can be mobilized to perpetrate violence again. So, I mean, this is very common within gang areas, where you'll see sort of gangs are there, and then they've perpetrated violence in the community, and then something happens and the same gangs are activated again to perpetrate that violence. And I think we've seen the same within KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, where groups often linked to hostels are mobilized to engage in violence and perpetrate violence. And we sort of saw groups perpetrating violence during the 1980s, during the political transition, where we saw sort of mass violence and hostile members being mobilized to perpetrate that violence. Similar dynamics happening around xenophobic violence in 2008 and 2015. But it's not only individuals coming out of hostels, there often are groups within communities who, kind of view violence as a way of solving problems and dealing with frustrations. And in many of these communities, there's often these kind of insufficient protective factors and processes in place. There's often this, lack of countervailing views, countervailing groups, for example, strong community voices that will say, no, we're not going to engage in violence. No, we're not going to engage in looting. So in these kind of places, usually there's more risk factors and protective factors that are in place. Then just to talk a bit about sort of service delivery protests, since this is the more common form of violence that's been happening within South Africa and will continue to affect us going forward, and may be the context in which looting continues to happen. And it's this really sort of reinforcing what I've already said, is that often service delivery protests happen in communities where they sort of view nonviolent protesting as being ineffective. So if you want to get government's attention, that you kind of have to burn things, you have to destroy things, then government will give you some attention, and then maybe come and talk to you about solving the problems. And often there are sort of traditions that have been there around the use of violence. I mean, we've seen in many communities that are, violent, that we've seen violent service delivery today. Often these were places where sort of the strategy of making townships ungovernable during the 1980s was used, and that sort of strategy has been perpetrated or continued to be used into the future. Not always the case, but certainly it has happened in many places. There's often this kind of issues where you've got other risk factors around sort of frustration or sort of relative deprivation or sort of poverty combined with anger and frustration. And this is, if we sort of listen and read what's been written about the current violence and unrest, there's a lot of this discourse about, we're angry, we're frustrated, government hasn't delivered, I don't have a job, I've lost my job, as a possible explanation for the current unrest, but also plays out quite extensively within service delivery protests as well. And this sort of, especially with sort of young, marginalized, angry men, as the sort of status issue also comes up, as I've mentioned before, roles around aggressive masculinity, opportunism. This is where looting is kind of a key issue, where you get these contexts of disorder, and then opportunities emerge for those who feel that the time is ripe to engage in looting, or are desperate to engage in looting, or engage in looting because others are engaging in looting. But often around service delivery protests, there's usually some form of what's known as political entrepreneurship, where you've got groups, individuals within a community who are looking to be recognized by political parties, or ultimately want to become a councillor, build up legitimacy, build up support within a community. And one way of doing it is organizing protests around common grievances such as service delivery, and kind of use violence as a way to do that. Then just moving on to xenophobic violence, and of course many of you are familiar with this, where usually xenophobic violence starts with with some sort of crisis, whether it's real, perceived, or manufactured. And it's usually about, well, the foreigners are taking our jobs, or there's an economic crisis where there aren't enough jobs, or the sort of social concerns within communities that there are, too many others are settling within our communities and affecting our way of life. And then these kind of crisis gets largely exploited by certain political leaders, and then it's reinforced by the sort of negative role of the media and social media, and also of kind of social networks. And there's often other forms of risk factors that drive this sort of violence, where other concerns within the community, other sort of senses around that other important processes within the community are being undermined. Then what happens is there's usually a trigger event, and it can be, in many cases around xenophobic violence at the local level, there's often an altercation that happens in a foreign-owned spaza shop, where someone is engaged in alleged theft, or a group comes in and tries to rob the owner or manager of the spaza shop, and the owner or manager responds often with violence, or there's some form of altercation that happens, and then that triggers a whole lot of xenophobic attitudes within the community. And then you'll see often violence happening as a result of that, especially when there's no kind of countervailing protective forces and factors in place, where community groups who can intervene, such as a community police forum, or kind of a strong community leadership that will come in and try and manage the situation. But if there are these many risk factors in place, you'll often see sort of violence happening around, linked to xenophobia in these kind of contexts. Then just some data around xenophobic violence, and you can sort of see, this is produced by Xenowatch only up to September 2019. I haven't seen more recent cases, but in xenophobic violence, we've certainly seen these major episodes of it, 2008, 2015, 2019, and we've seen some more recent cases as well around this. And it tends to happen in waves, but it is, xenophobic violence is a fairly frequent occurrence, but you just do have these concentrated forms, and often they've taken the same type of process. They follow the same sort of process that we've seen recently within KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, where it sort of starts in specific areas and then explodes into other areas. And then finally, around sort of collective violence is the orchestration and looting. And we've seen this, so I'm just sort of reinforcing what I've said already. We've seen instigation and encouragement by certain leaders at a sort of higher political level, but also we've seen it at the local level as well. We've seen brokerage at multiple levels, so those who are encouraging others to engage in violence and looting. The group contexts have contributed to norm changes that we've seen, kind of individuals in places who normally wouldn't engage in criminality, but in the context of widespread looting have participated and engaged in looting and destruction of property. In many of these places, there's sort of been weak and absent countervailing community factors. So, kind of weak or kind of divided community leaders and leadership and groups who haven't been able to try and prevent the looting from happening. In some places, we've seen community groups playing really important roles that once the looting has started, have sort of stood up against it and been able to contain the looting and prevent the looting from spreading. But in many places, there's been this sort of violent vanguard of predominantly young men that have driven the looting. Not only against local township businesses and informal sector businesses, but also in the case of shopping malls and warehouses, where you've seen sort of this violent vanguard at the front who've kind of targeted the facilities, and then others have come in and participated in looting after that. And of course, the sort of reasons for looting have been different. They've been personal reasons. Others have got on due for opportunities. We've also seen different justifications for the looting taking place. And then it's just, when we look at collective violence, there's just a lot of factors that come into play. So this is the important thing about collective violence, is there very much it's a complex issue. There's so many, it's not monocausal. There's different factors that will influence why collective violence takes place. So that's why I'm just trying to bring everything together in one slide here. Then the final thing I want to talk about was really around policing. I'm not going to spend too much time here, but it's certainly been a key consideration with, why has government responded the way? Why weren't the police able to contain this violence within KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng? Why did the police not go to every single incident? Why did the military have to come in? So in a very sort of summarized way, an important thing about policing in South Africa is it's been quite militarized for many, many years due to historical reasons, due to kind of ideological, institutional reasons with South Africa. It's remained militarized because trust between the police and South Africans is quite low. Many other government departments in South Africa haven't really come to the party in terms of solving many of the other determinants of violent crime in South Africa. So the South African police, in dealing with crime and unrest and collective violence, takes quite a kind of militaristic approach to this. The use of force, you want to disperse crowds as quickly as possible, and you have to use kind of large numbers of police to do it, and you have to use kind of certain types of kind of forceful weapons to do that. And it's worked quite well for the police in the past during the apartheid era. It's worked quite well for the police certainly from the mid-1990s around, when crowds form and there's collective violence, the police sort of show up in force in armored vehicles, use riot control equipment, and in most cases are able to disperse the crowd and arrest instigators. But it's largely been premised on sort of the sense of, the crowds are fairly small and containable. And because of this public order policing within South Africa, and this is the group within the police who have to respond to crowd situations, and it was largely neglected between the mid-1990s and 2012. The focus was on trying to get, kind of visible policing right, trying to get crime prevention right at the sort of local level, trying to do institutional reform. And, they sort of didn't pay much attention to it, didn't engage in specialized forms of public order policing. It existed, but they didn't invest in it in terms of specialized training and providing resources to the public order policing units. Then, of course, Marikana happens, and Marikana happens because you had the more militarized components of the police, such as the tactical response teams and the national intervention units, going into Marikana, and because they were there, and then Marikana protests, strike got out of control, and you had the most militarized policing units there, and they fired on the crowds, and then engaged in kind of shooting thereafter. You kind of had this reflection within the police, and obviously the commission of inquiry around, how do you deal with crowd situations. So it led to reforms within the police, and a need to recapacitate it, and the use to make use of less lethal weapons in that context. But in terms of developing public order policing within South Africa, it was sort of based on the assumption that there will continue to be violence within South Africa, but it'll be sporadic. It'll be in this community, on this particular day, it might be on that community, and this other day. Occasionally, there may be coordinated protests, but it won't be at the levels that we've recently experienced. So the sort of planning that had been done, the threat perceptions, the sort of threat matrix that had been prepared, never really anticipated the sort of violence that was going forward. I mean, it should have been, because all the red flags were there, but certainly it was based on the assumption that we will continue to have service delivery protests, labor protests going forward, and the police will be able to contain it. So I just want to give you some sort of idea of numbers. So when the violence happened in KZN and Gauteng recently, it happened so quickly and it happened in so many different places, the police really couldn't respond. So if you look here, in the mid-2000s, there was, between 7,000 and 8,000 public order police personnel, and then obviously got neglected, they got redeployed. And it sort of dropped down to less than 3,000. And then since 2012, it's sort of increased up. We're not quite at 6,000 yet. And then, of course, if you're looking at the public order police units, these are scattered across South Africa. It's grown in number as well. But not enough to deal with what currently happened within South Africa. And the sort of the usual approach that the public order police have is when they get deployed what happens in crowd situations is usually the public order police should be taking the lead because they're trained in dealing with crowd situations. But when you have so many crowd situations happening, you don't have enough public order police personnel to deal with it, particularly when it's happening and it's concentrated in one or two provinces, that you've got a small number of police there. In the case, I'm not sure of the numbers in KZN, but it's going to be sort of, no more than 2,000, probably between 1,000 and 2,000. And you've got to kind of spread them to so many different areas that are happening that obviously they're not going to cope with this. And this is just to give you, moving towards closure here, some sort of indication of, public order incidents within South Africa. That we have been seeing increases in recent years, particularly around unrest. So that's the lower line. But in a way, from the police's perspective, for them looking at this sort of data is that, we can still, contain this kind of violence with the resources that we have. But certainly going forward, given what's happened in KwaZulu-Natal and and in Gauteng, it's, the possibility, are we going to see this form of violence and this degree of violence happening in the future? And if this is the case, then we really need to be thinking differently about how the police can respond to this form of violence. And to sort of finish off, this is, the News 24 prepared a map around the sort of violence that happened. And you've got so many incidences happening at the same time, the police just don't have the resources and the person power to get to them all at one particular point in time. And that's why you had these cases where looting was taking place for days and the police just weren't there because they were somewhere else. So let me just bring that to an end. I was aiming for half an hour, unfortunately went to 35 minutes, but we still do have time for comments and questions. So I would welcome that. There was a lot of material also to digest. So thank you so much for the time and the opportunity, and I welcome any comments or questions.
Yeah, Dr. Lam, thank you so much for a really insightful presentation, putting what some of us experienced in first person last week in the context of the social and psychological academic context, let me put it that way, really helps us understand better what happened, and also I would say also cope better, because when you understand things, it's better to put in place mechanism to cope with it. I saw that we have several questions already, and again I will encourage the participants to use the Q&A facility to ask questions, because we have around 100 participants and it's difficult to allow them all to speak. May I maybe ask Kimara, please, would you like to start guiding us through the questions?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we have quite a few comments and questions. Maybe the first one I can ask is, Someone asked, considering the timing of the violence, I would also request Dr. Lam to talk about the role of the lockdowns, the COVID corruption with COVID grants and etc. Do you think these factors contributed to the violent incidents that occurred?
Sure. I'm happy. Let me think it's best maybe to respond to question by question. I think what we're starting to see with the picture is certainly unfolding. What happened in the context, my reading, and I think I'm sort of echoing what others have been saying as well, is that the state of poverty and desperation in many communities and anger in many communities was weaponized by certain instigators. And what lockdowns and COVID had done is that it made people who were in quite desperate situations even more desperate and even more angry. So you had people who were, kind of earning, a monthly income that would enable them to kind of get by and just get by, or who had been in semi-comfortable positions but still living in a degree of poverty, kind of losing that income and putting themselves in desperate situations, resulting in desperate situations, losing, kind of they'd been in houses or rented accommodation, which was fairly secure, and then now having to move to informal settlements. So it kind of made people had been in a more desperate and angry situation. And when, the unrest was initiated and started in specific communities, those kind of anger was kind of channeled and directed in specific places. So I think that played quite an important role as a kind of a contributing factor. And then a kind of questions around kind of corruption. I think this sort of sense of, well, kind of government is not helping us out. We've kind of getting frustrated with government. Government is just stealing money and resources. So we need to look after ourselves. Seems to be a kind of a common discourse that's coming out as well. So, I mean, absolutely, these played key factors and were used very effectively by the instigators and orchestrators of this violence.
Cool, thank you. Another one says, okay, so that they were certain that you would cite poverty as one of the causes of violence. That was actually before your talk even started. And so they ask, but if we compare with a country like India, which has more people that are more poor, but this kind of violence or crime is not seen there, do you have any explanation for this?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, even if we just look at South Africa, it's, that happened in very specific parts of Gauteng and parts of KwaZulu-Natal. And, we saw the sort of violence happening as a prelude to it was in the Free State. And, no one's really talking about the Free State, but it seems particularly linkages to Ace Makashule and his suspension from the ANC. And then there was violence linked to that. But in many other parts of South Africa where it's desperately poor, we didn't see this form of violence. So I think, poverty is not a direct cause of it, but it certainly creates conditions that can be exploited for violence to take place. But there have to be these other forms there. There have to be individuals who are willing to perpetrate violence. There have to be groups that are, see violence as legitimate. And I think that's where we sort of saw concentrations of that within KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, and the use of these kind of individuals and groups to engage in the violence. So poverty is definitely not a direct cause of it.
Okay, thank you. Then we have one that says, we have a lot actually, but the next one says, do you think we have effective intelligence services in South Africa? And basically that the belief that the recent looting was driven by specific instigators, or do you think it was just people deciding on their own to behave the way that they did?
Well, I mean, the issue around intelligence services and my take on this and reading of the situation is it was a complete failure of the intelligence services. I mean, there was a report by Sydney, driven by Sydney Mufamadi. He was a former cabinet minister, and he was tasked to lead a high-level panel to look into the state security agency. And the report, for those of you interested in reading, it's available online. It paints a very bleak and disparaging picture about the intelligence services, that they are not in a position to really predict effective threats against South Africa. They didn't pick up on the planning that was happening that led into the looting and the unrest. And I think it was clear to many who were watching the build up to former President Zuma's arrest and know KwaZulu-Natal and know of the sort of violence hotspots within Gauteng, that there would be violence. And intelligence services seem to have not kind of produced the intelligence that was required. Maybe they did. and their intelligence wasn't taken seriously, or it wasn't actionable intelligence. But it seems quite clear, even the admission by the minister and by the president, that the intelligence services didn't adequately prepare South Africans and the authorities for this. Also, crime intelligence is undergoing quite a severe crisis at the moment. So yes, I mean, in my view on it is there needs to be a serious look at the intelligence service and sort of look at how it can be reformed, how it can, is it using the most effective ways of gathering intelligence within the context of a democracy? Is there quality intelligence there? We know there were many Zuma loyalists that were still with the intelligence services up till recently. There's possibility of parallel structures in place, counter intelligence operations in place. So there's a lot that needs to be done around intelligence. I agree completely. And then also about, the kind of, could the violence been prevented and who was involved as, I'm sorry, just looking on, okay, questions, could that be prevented? Well, possibly been prevented, yes. I mean, there was, okay, sorry, I'm just looking at different questions here. Okay, so it was around, role of intelligence, they could have done a much better job. And I think questions around violence being instigated this was largely driven by individuals at different levels. So you've got people at a sort of more senior level that have been very vocal, sort of supportive of former President Zuma. But then, of course, you did have at communities where the violence was concentrated. You had groups that individuals that encouraged it, and it wasn't just individuals deciding to do it themselves. A process of looting was started, then ordinary residents participated in it, following on from that.
Okay, cool. I think many people had those questions relating to prevention, so thanks for answering that. Someone said, do you not think that these demonstrations in the two provinces was a pilot run to see the response of the community, if they'd actually come out in their numbers? And is it not a concern that the memorandum will change form from being free Zuma to poverty alleviation? And when that happens, we'll experience a much more aggressive state of disaster. So what can we do to assist in ending corruption to cancel the poverty box that contributes to this violence?
I mean, these issues are all connected. I think, there's the high level stuff that needs to be done. I mean, I think there are efforts at play within government to deal with grand scale corruption, to deal with many of the challenges that government is confronting. But I think in terms of trying to prevent these things from going forward, this is where intelligence, not only from the intelligence services, but also from other government departments, come in to say, well, here are areas where you're potentially going to see violence in the future. And, we know many of the driving factors of it, and we need to work in these specific areas to improve prevention, to kind of reduce the driving factors of it. So if there are these combinations of communities that feel very disconnected from government due to a lack of service delivery in these sort of places, and there are specific groups there that are willing to take advantage of it, it's about focusing on those areas and trying to uplift those areas and address the sort of factors that are in place there. And this is something that government has actually been trying to do, but it requires the whole of government to do it, and it's largely just been the police that have been targeting the hotspot areas and not the rest of government. So going forward, it's about taking that kind of area-based approach. I mean, cities are starting to do it, but if you're wanting to do it, kind of have an effect long term, that's what you really need to do. Starting with that, and it's about within those contexts of finding ways to build trust between government and the police. And it's worked in some areas, but you really need to be doing that in the specific areas going forward. And there's questions about kind of dry runs, and is there a phase 2, is there a phase 3, or other phases going up? That's really unclear at the moment and worrying. I mean, what it has demonstrated, the recent looting, is that looting can be used quite effectively. It's difficult to control and difficult to direct and channel, because you are, kind of dependent on it. It's about different motivations why people loot, and often people will loot to acquire the specific goods and then they'll return home. But I suppose it's demonstrated that looting can be used as a very destructive force, can be used as a destabilizing force. But my one take from it is that the group behind this don't necessarily have the resources to engage in a full-scale insurrection. It's more just they are just able to mobilize people for unrest. And so it may be, reflecting on what's been happened is that others or the same groups could potentially try to orchestrate it somewhere else. But you do have to have the networks and groups in place. So I think within KwaZulu-Natal, those who instigated it had the groups in place who are willing to encourage the looting, wherein like somewhere like, Cape Town or in the Northern Cape, they just don't have, just have the resources. I mean, we've had this incident within Gauteng, I think it was in Roodepoort, where a member of the Patriotic Alliance was, alleged to have, accused of engaging in looting, but that didn't really lead to anything because he didn't have the networks to do it. And we've seen this, for example, in Cape Town, where there was an expectation that there would be looting, and there wasn't any because the networks that are here are not connected to the instigators. So sorry, a long answer to the question, but it was a particularly good question.
Thank you. Okay, we have one from Tanuja that says, can you comment on the emergence of armed civilians who have themselves committed crimes while protecting poverty and the people?
Yeah, I mean, this is quite common in cases of unrest. You'll see when unrest is particularly not directed in areas, and it takes on where certain areas and communities get targeted, especially with looting, where private property is being looted, or where residents are feeling particularly fearful and scared. I mean, in a case within the US, if we use that example, where during the Black Lives Matter protests, movements and marches, you saw marches going past white middle class wealthy areas, and in some cases kind of property owners coming out with guns and threatening the protesters, and we've seen more extreme things happening here, but in other places where police just aren't able to cope and communities are targeted or feel targeted and set up, kind of mobilize into sort of community protection groups, community defense units, as we've seen in Phoenix. And the problem with that is these groups very quickly can become vigilante groups, and where they perpetrate violence are effectively vigilantes, and that can spiral out of control very quickly, can lead to much larger violence taking place. In some cases, properties have been protected and lives have been saved, but it's a double-edged sword here, is that these kind of groups often then do break the law and engage in violence, and can be arrested as a result of that, and that violence can escalate. And that's, I think, what happened in some places in KwaZulu-Natal, where you saw groups who came together and protected their communities and blocked entry into the communities and did racial profiling. And in those kind of cases, violence escalated. And we've seen that, I mean, in Cape Town, there've been a number of cases where we've had groups that have been set up to counter gangsterism, and that's resulted in escalation of violence and vigilantism and lynchings and killings and acts of terrorism as well. So yeah, a key issue to think about.
Yeah, thanks. And a follow-up on that, do you have any comment on like the motivation for destroying schools or the healthcare facilities that were already marginalized, in already marginalized communities, that may never recover?
I mean, this is something that's been going on for a while, and it usually is related to these sort of service delivery protests, kind of objections to, kind of local government's corruption. And this goes back to the apartheid era, where a sort of a demonstration of power from certain communities, a demonstration of opposition to apartheid, that we will, view what's been built by the apartheid government as, we view this as illegitimate, and we will destroy it as a demonstration of its illegitimacy and a demonstration of our power. And that is sort of projected forward into the era here, where we destroy, where infrastructure is destroyed to demonstrate dissatisfaction, to demonstrate the power, to get government's attention. So it's this work that's been done by Wits University, and it was the report was called "The Smoke That Calls," and it was to say, well, we burn things, government will actually come and speak to us and address our concerns. But often what happens in these violent situations is the sort of orgy of violence often takes over, where you sort of burn some tires, and then the violence starts to escalate and the police get involved, and elements of the crowd get angry, and it's responded by destroying government infrastructure as just destroy it for the sake of destroying it, or some see it as a way of demonstrating our dissatisfaction, but don't think about the long-term consequences of it, that namely you are going to lose this community resource. So it's unfortunately, it's often not logical what the motivations are.
Yes, thank you. There were many comments, further comments and questions related to, improvements on police service, etc., that you've already answered. But one more by Patrick was that KZN has always been known as a hotspot that perpetrates violence even pre-democracy. And he says this is predominantly tribalist. The demographics of tribe has not changed. And do you think this will get better? And if so, what will be the approach?
I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, it's people analyze what's been happening in KZN from different perspectives. Of course, kind of tribalism plays quite an important role and group affiliation plays quite an important role in violence in many contexts. I think what we've been seeing in KwaZulu-Natal is because of kind of quite tight-knit tribalism in some areas that it can be mobilized very quickly. I mean, we saw this, for example, during the 2015 xenophobic violence within KZN and parts of Gauteng, is that you had the late King Goodwill-Zwelithini engaging in kind of quite in incendiary language and kind of arguably hate speech and sort of encouraging the use of violence against foreigners, and then that violence happened very quickly. So it's the way in which the kind of groups are so tightly knit and kind of quite cohesive that the violence can happen if it's encouraged through these sort of networks. So how things stand within KZN is I don't see things changing, unless, of course, there are conversation within sort of leadership within the province around this and how do we turn this sort of situation around. But if those conversations don't happen, this is unlikely to take place. And also it's around there are many individuals who make use of this kind of this tight-knit ethnicity within KZN and use it for their own purposes, and sort of this political manipulation of it. If that doesn't change, we're going to continue to see this happening into the future.
Yeah. And following up on that, we had quite a few questions from Wanda, Jason, and Shireen relating to, if I can sum it up, asking, to what extent do you think race was involved? And do you think instigators would use race as a tool to initiate violence?
I think race seemed to have played a role. I mean, it was in creating unrest and instability. There was obviously economic considerations that came into place around targeting key economic components and points, such as roads, shopping malls, businesses. That was a key consideration. But I think also in terms of creating instability and unrest, it was part of the objective was to target key race fault lines within KZN, and that we saw that happening around trying to focus on areas where there's tensions between Indian and Black communities within KZN, Phoenix being one place, and to encourage unrest there as a way to kind of pursue and for kind of race-related violence to happen in those sort of places. So it seems to have been a consideration, maybe not the major consideration, but it seems to have been part of the playbook that was used.
Okay, thank you. And it's almost out of time. Thanks for allowing enough time for questions. Someone asked, Kajura asked, is the violence most likely to affect the economic and political terrain in South Africa? And if yes, in which direction do you think?
I mean, the violence we know is going to have, it's already having a major impact on the economy, because it's the destruction that's happened. Now government has to try and find ways and means to support this. It's undermined people's income generating ability. It's undermined investor confidence within South Africa. It's undermined the ability for government to collect taxes. So of course, it's going to have major economic consequences. It's going to have consequences on future investment within South Africa. I mean, I don't know if it wasn't coincidental that Moody's downgraded, most cities within South Africa in terms of their prospects for borrowing last week. So yeah, of course, this violence is going to have very serious consequences for the economy and politically as well. I think especially in the context of the ruling party and the build up to the local government elections, where it's quite clear that things are fairly unstable within the ruling party. And so we're likely to see continued violence, maybe not at this particular scale. It all depends around how sort of different factions within the ruling party are able to mediate what's going on at the moment. But certainly politically, we're entering an unstable and an uncertain future.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Lamb. Maybe to conclude on a kind of maybe on a look in the future kind of aspect, if you had access to all state resources, what would be the first issue that you would address to make sure that a situation like last week never happens again?
Well, I think it would be my priority would be to focus on those areas where the sort of violence has taken place, and to, from a government point of view, I think it would be look at how these areas are managed and governed from government's point of view. Make sure you've got the best possible councillors in place, that you're able to address many of the key concerns in these specific areas, and look to build trust in a sustainable way, not to go and to do the kind of go around the walk arounds and do the handshaking, but it's actually to put resources where you can into these areas and to fix the problems in these areas. I think, a key issue that hasn't been dealt with as well here is, for example, dealing with the hostel issue. In many cases, these are the sort of epicenters where violence comes in. Government's been talking about it, trying to improve these kind of situations and hasn't been able to deal with this sort of issue. But I would go focus on the areas where the violence emanated from and address the kind of drivers of violence in these places would be my first point of action.
Okay, then thank you very much. And I think we reached our time limit. So Dr. Lamb, thank you so much for being with us this morning. And I'm sure all the participants are thanking you as well, because we saw from the large amount of questions that these are really topics that are in everyone's heart at the moment. And I would like to thank also Kimara and Ilya for Kimara for moderating the questions, and Ilya for all the back office technology behind the scenes. So thank you very much to you as well. And I wish you all a good day, and please stay safe, because apparently the violence is behind us, but COVID is still out there. Yeah. So be careful, and we hope to see you again next week. We have again a very interesting talk that we will advertise in the course of the morning. So thank you very much. All the best. Thank you very much, Dr. Lamb. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for your time.
Bye.